So you may wonder what the purpose or the point of yesterday's video was about the case in Wyoming. Well, the point was that prior to Nixon, a lot of legislation had to be evidence-based in this country. A lot of judges were trained in evidence-based policy. And the propaganda-based policy started with Nixon, or it didn't. I don't know that it actually started with Nixon, but it sure as hell got refined under Nixon, where it became more important for public relations to prevail over actual evidence. So what the United States government did under Nixon was take a page out of Hitler's postmodern view of propaganda under Goebbels and went all in with a propaganda war against the drugs that were coming from Southeast Asia. And they were also using the drug war as some sort of discriminatory device to punish poor people and minorities and all kinds of other ulterior motives there. But the point is, what I experienced in Wyoming was an example of what should have been experienced all over the country. And that is, the judge up there wasn't just going to take the prosecutor's allegation that we were poisoning millions of Americans and destroying America through marijuana and stuff like that, but he actually did some research before rendering a decision. And he researched the concept of marijuana and drug interdiction and things like that, comparing it and determining whether there was a logical basis for going after people with minimum mandatory sentences. There was a 5-year minimum mandatory sentence on a marijuana sale that you couldn't get out of. And back then, most prosecutors that I faced off against in federal court were against any kind of minimum mandatory sentence. They didn't believe in them. They didn't believe it was good policy. They believed that the judges should evaluate the circumstances and things like this. One of the important things that happened during that era is that the propagandists went out claiming judges were discriminatory. There was no parity or equality in sentencing. There was big sentencing disparagement, and we should have a sentencing panel and sentencing done by what they called a matrix. In other words, a mathematical formula on how much time somebody should be sentenced to, not based on the person, but based on the conduct. So if you sold 100 grams of cocaine, you got 100 years. If you sold 1,000 grams of cocaine, you got 1,000 years. I mean, I'm exaggerating. I don't know the exact figures right now, but that was the principle. And what we did is we shifted crime from determining what kind of person the criminal is to what he did, and judge what he did rather than who he was. So sociology became irrelevant. Psychologists took over the procedure and took over the philosophy of sentencing, and whether or not you were a good guy didn't matter anymore. It was whether or not you did a bad act. This comes right straight from medieval Druidism, but that's a whole other lecture. Anyway, the judge in this case, Judge Bremmer, researched the effects of marijuana, the policy of marijuana, things like that, and came to the conclusion that a lot of the marijuana policy was bullshit. And it was just that, it was publicity based, and it had no realistic base in criminal jurisprudence. And that's why he did what he did. That wasn't unusual. I had another case in Kansas where the judge there didn't like the 5-year minimum mandatory sentence, delayed the case around for various reasons until we could come up with a disposition where there wasn't a minimum mandatory sentence. Uh, in 1968, the possession of marijuana was the only minimum mandatory sentence in the drug laws that I can remember. And nobody liked it, either prosecutor or defendant. That all changed again under Nixon because Nixon came in with a full force or full court press on propaganda. Um, this was what was later to become known as the German School of Postmodern Theory, dealing with the propagandization of enemies and particularly Jews in the German school. I don't want to get into the theoretical sociology because even my colleagues there don't understand a lot of this, so I just get brain damaged thinking about it. But the real fact of the matter is that the policy changed, and it changed deliberately under the Nixon administration, under their law and order platform. And law and order back then meant let's keep the hippies in line, let's punish the anti-war protesters, and while we're at it, let's keep the minorities in jail so they don't threaten anybody and instill fear. We can instill fear instead of them. At least that's my cynical view of the situation back then. And it's really hard for people to understand what was going on back then. When I grew up, we had duck and cover exercises. We were just coming out of World War II. Germans were bad guys. Japanese were bad guys. Other people were good guys. The Italians had been bad guys, but now we're good guys. But because of organized crime and the war on crime, they were starting to become bad guys again. It was hard to keep track then, but things were fairly clear-cut. At least the Russians were consistently bad guys under the doctrine of the government of the United States. So we were coming out of World War II. We were getting, the economy was thriving. People were falling in line. They had the same goals. All the parents that went through World War II wanted the world better for their children, and they were striving hard to get that. But there was this undertow of rebellion, I guess you would call it, the idea of the rebel without a cause. Movies were about that. We had the advent of the ducktail haircuts, which was the opposite to what my father used to refer to as GI haircuts. He was fanatical about not having long hair because it symbolized something that he wasn't for. His whole life was around the VFW, and he was a proud World War II vet from the Battle of the Bulge and the Berchtesgaden campaign, and also liberation of the concentration camps. So he had an entirely jaundiced view of the world based on what he had seen the Nazis perform during the 1940s. And this was the world into which we were born. So growing up, we had duck and cover exercises. There was a missile site 10 miles from Loveland. We made nerve gas in Rocky Flats, at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, atomic bombs at Rocky Flats. We were on ground zero, essentially, and we all grew up with that. And I think the rest of the country was to a lesser extent in the same posture. So when we were clamped down upon to conform for no reason or stated reason, we rebelled a little bit. When we were told to go to Vietnam for no reason, we rebelled a little bit. And the rebellion was viewed in one way by one generation and in another way by another generation. So we had this whole idea after the Kennedy assassination of we have to clamp down, we got to stop the anti-war protesters, we got to make the kids cut their hair, we got to make the kids quit smoking dope and protesting the war and things like this. So that's where it was going. And the Hill and Knowlton people under Nixon's kitchen cabinet came up with ideas like, let's have a bunch of law and order programs. So they invented O'Hare Treasury, the FBI, various other, the Treasury Department series. All of this was to sharpen the protocols or the goals of law and order, clamping down on crime and things like this. So when the Justice Department fell in step with Mitchell's campaign against crime, there was, thankfully at that time, a few federal judges who still believed in evidence-based policy and in common law and questioned what was going on. And what was going on at that time, not only did they recodify a lot of criminal law, they attacked the Supreme Court, particularly Justice Warren, for the decisions of search and seizure, right to counsel, double jeopardy, things such as this, constitutional measures that people hadn't objected to earlier. But that was due to the run of the cases in which they wanted to apply due process, basic due process, to all the criminal cases through all the 48 and then 50 states. So we had what they'd call a basic due process, which meant you had a right to counsel if you were accused of a crime. That came out in Escobedo versus Illinois. You had the Miranda case where you had to advise somebody of his rights and the fact that he was entitled to counsel, various other things. But in that, with the illegality of contraband, such as marijuana and other drugs, there was a really declination of the right to be free from search and seizure, because drugs could disappear rather easily, and you came up with no-knock warrants, preventive detention ideas, things such as this that didn't exist before. So it was in a real state of flux, and it was necessary for the legislators to take control of court appointees in order to get their agendas made. And judges like Bremmer kind of stood in the way there because they were standing up for logic and common law. Now, the other thing you've got to understand is when they beat away or beat down constitutional requirements based on common law principles, they also instituted what I refer to as Napoleonic or civil law principles. And the common law principle of looking at the nature of the criminal rather than the act was in our justice system for at least 10 centuries. And when we had the drug laws, that concept changed. The drugs were the bad things, and the people dealing with them were implements and therefore should be punished as implements, and their backgrounds, etc., didn't really matter. So we weren't punishing the criminals, we were punishing the contraband, and the people that touched the contraband, and intent really didn't matter that much. And that became the precursor to the statutory law we have now. So judges like Bremmer had to be forced to retire or had to be kicked out or whatever. The same is true of the case I had in Kansas. I had another case in Texas where similar results were transmitted, or at least similar in results. Similar results, I'm sorry. Anyway, that's why the video was posted. It was posted as an example in contrast. I also wrote an article back then in the 70s about it, which I'll paste on my Dennis Blewett face page, and maybe some other publication things that I have. I don't know yet. I haven't made up my mind, but I hope you liked the explanation and enjoyed my presentation about the Wyoming case. Thank you very much. Give me some comments. Bye.